So now I'm pleased to welcome our final presenter of the day, Lauren Kuryloski. Lauren is an assistant professor of teaching in the Department of Engineering Education within the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Lauren's teaching areas include engineering education and technical communications, and has also taught technical writing for the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and advanced writing at Northwestern University. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, and thank you for having me. Thanks to everyone who has been here all day and is still here for the final presentation. I'm going to share my screen. I think there will be some productive overlap with some of the things that Jessica was just talking about, so I think that will be helpful. Okay, can everybody see things now? Okay. All right, so thank you again for being here. I'm Lauren Kuryloski from Engineering Education. And so I actually wanted to start by just being very transparent about my experience with remote learning this past spring. So I did not actually go through the transition in the same way that most other instructors did. I was piloting a new course that was delivered entirely online all semester. And so in as much as anyone could have felt fortunate in any way in the spring of 2020, I did feel fortunate in that sense. I wasn't in that spring break scramble like I know a lot of other people were. However, I hope that I can still make some meaningful contributions to the discussions we've been having today. I'm going to talk about two courses that I helped to create in their online forms. A graduate level technical communication course that ran for the first time in the spring of 2020, and the required undergraduate technical communication course that we in engineering education just started offering online in the summer of 2019. All of this is to say, I've been thinking a lot about remote learning for the past year or so, and so I hope that some of what I'm going to talk about today will be transferable to any number of courses. So I've actually added in a slide here just as a way of beginning. I thought I would start by addressing some of the challenges associated with remote learning. Of course, we've already addressed a number of them throughout the day. And so I'm just going to think specifically about some of the hurdles associated with remote learning and the delivery of writing intensive communication courses. And I don't think you have to be, a writing instructor or a communication instructor in order to hopefully make use of what I'm talking about. These are primarily small discussion-based classes. I think we see that in, across many disciplines, and courses that rely on close peer-to-peer and peer-to-peer instructor interaction. And so therefore they present their own kinds of challenges when we're talking about remote learning. So now, as a kind of overview to the rest of my talk, I'm going to walk through a few specific challenges that my colleagues and I faced, and then set up some of the solutions that I'll then show you in greater detail in a few moments. So first, how do we deliver lectures effectively? In my courses, lecture is not the primary means of content delivery, and so those lectures are fairly short. I think Jessica used a term lecturette, which I hadn't heard before, but I really liked, and so I think I'll immediately start using that. And so to this end, I'll talk a little bit about instructional panopto videos of varying levels of formality and weekly blogs. So if we're not doing a lot of lectures, we are, in contrast, doing a lot of in-class discussions that need to be delivered in some other form. And so I'll talk about making use of the discussion board, blog comments, and platforms like Padlet and Eli Review. In my classes, which are essentially workshop-style courses, we are doing a lot of small group activity. And so that obviously needs to take some alternative form. And so I'll talk about peer working groups and then weekly small group meetings via Zoom. I think one of the most integral components of the technical communication courses is the interaction between instructors and students. So it feels like to me sometimes a surprising number of students that come to me for letters of recommendation. And when they do, they say things like, all of my other classes this semester are lectures with 100+ people, but you know me. You know who I am as an individual. You know what my work looks like because we're in small courses together. And so I really don't want to lose that in the shift to moving online. And so I'll say a bit about weekly just-in-time videos, again, weekly meetings, and how we can incorporate frequent and kind of immediate forms of feedback so students feel like they have that regular contact point. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about my plans, my long-term plans for optimizing long-term delivery. So the spring was very stressful for everyone. And so after, we've done this once or twice, how do we not just get through it, but really optimize that experience? And so I'll just cover a few of my, my plans for the future that I hope to roll out, if not in the fall semester, then definitely as we move into the spring. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I plan to discuss 2 courses today. I'll take a walk through each individually and then also spend a moment talking about some techniques that I employed across both courses. So the first class I'll talk about is EAS 580, which is Technical Communication for Engineers, and that is the class that I was teaching in the spring 2020 semester. Just for some background, this is part of the online master's program in engineering management. It's kind of a MOOC style course, MOOC being a massive open online course. I would say it's kind of MOOC light. There are about 50 some students in it in the spring and probably around that number in the fall, which isn't massive probably by most people's standards. It is quite large for a writing intensive course. And most students in the class were working engineers, and then some were full-time graduate students working on this master's program. And it's important to point out that both of the classes I'll talk about today are delivered primarily asynchronously. So before we look at a number of examples of what the 580 course looked like in practice, I just want to offer an overview of some of the approaches that I'll be talking about. What I found to work particularly well were short, weekly, writing intensive assignments. And so in a lot of courses, there may be 3 or 4 major units over the course of the semester. And so there's this downtime in between those major units. In this class, students had an assignment due every week. Typically that was concise, so maybe 500 words or less. It was also usually low stakes in terms of point value, but they did have this regular engagement with the course all semester long. I used the platform Eli Review to facilitate that work, and I'll show you what that looks like in a decent amount of detail in a moment. But it's a means of facilitating that student collaboration and then also helping students manage their feedback, really. Although the class was primarily asynchronous, there were weekly synchronous meetings. So 30-minute small group meetings with either myself, the instructor, or the TA. We did a number of these things in the meeting. Sometimes they were structured activities. Sometimes they were just student-led discussion sessions. Towards the end of the semester, we really used them for conferencing when they were working on final projects. And another means to foster that student-to-student and also student-to-instructor interaction. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about different videos that I used, primarily Panopto videos in this course. Some of those were formal, meaning they had some production value, and that's what I used primarily to deliver course content. And some were informal Panopto videos I made on my own to give them kind of immediate feedback on what they were working on. This helped to keep my workload manageable as an instructor while still ensuring that the students were hearing from me on a regular basis. So I just outlined a number of approaches. I'll break them up into a couple different examples, so hopefully it's not too overwhelming all at once. And I'll start by giving you an introduction to Eli Review and the benefit of frequent low-stakes assignments, and then I'll talk a bit about how this can help to foster student-to-student interaction. So I've been talking about this Eli Review a lot, and it's a tool that I've found to be incredibly useful. It was created at Michigan State University. It's now available to anyone for a reasonable cost. And it places an emphasis on writing as an iterative process. So instead of thinking about writing as we sit down, we write something, we're done, it really looks at writing as first we write, then we review with someone else or other people, and then we revise and go through that process again. It also places an emphasis on the importance of peer-to-peer learning. And so the goal is to help students become better readers of their own work and the work of their peers. This approach lifts some of the burden of constant individualized feedback off of instructors and allows the instructor to be more targeted in giving feedback to the group. So this is a screenshot of the Eli Review dashboard. So if you signed in, this is essentially what you would see. And it's probably a little small, but hopefully you'll see that these are a number of assignments, and for each assignment, they cycle through that writing, reviewing, and revising process. And so this is all to say, while students have one assignment per week, that singular assignment has 3 components. And so they're always checking in with the course, with one another, and with me. So here's an example of one activity. This is the first part of the process, a writing task. And if you can see at the top of the page here, they are responding to a prompt that's asking them to create presentation slides. And the content here is not itself particularly important, but I do want to point out a few specific features of how assignments can be formatted within the system. And I think, on your own, if you never use Eli, just maybe some things to keep in mind. So all assignments remind students of the due date, of the point value associated with that assignment, and then any additional information they might want or need to know. So here I'm kind of forecasting next steps in the process. I'm also telling them where they would find the rubric for this assignment. So I've been working with engineers for a while now, and as a group, they really enjoy rules and guidelines and clarity. And so they've really been training me for a number of years to make sure that whatever I am putting out into the world is as clear and as comprehensive as possible. And that has been incredibly helpful practice for this transition to remote learning. As a number of people said throughout the day, you don't have that moment in class to just tell them, and remember, here's when it's due. And so really building that into all of the assignments has been helpful. I'd also like to introduce the idea of peer working groups. And so here's another screenshot from Eli, and you can see the classmates, they've all been anonymized here, but students are grouped together in these working groups. And so instead of saying you have to peer review, find someone, or you have to peer review, I'm just going to anonymize you or randomize you rather through this system, students work with the same group of peers for several weeks at a time. I would say in this semester, we maybe switched peer working groups 2 to 3 times, which means that they're working with one another, the same groups of peers for, let's say, 5 weeks at a time. And so this helps to create a sense of consistency, some familiarity, and collegiality. So we might not have that student-to-student interaction like we would in an in-person class, but they do get to know each other beyond kind of names that they occasionally work with. So we just looked at the writing task, and now this is the review task, or the second phase of that process. And I just want to point out a few features of how Eli Review structures the peer review process. And we're looking at it right now from a student perspective. And so here's where their work would show up if we were actually students logged into the system. Here's where their slides would be. And then here's how the review process is structured. So there's a trait identification section where they're asked to read their peers' work and see if they can identify like 4 or 5 different traits. And so they're not being turned loose, just write down whatever strikes you. But we're actually looking for 4 or 5 really important components that we would want to see in this project. There's a scale response, so rate their work on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of effectiveness, and then they're prompted to offer some contextual comments. So in addition to these really targeted pieces of feedback, comment on whatever else you want, or you can kind of guide them in that process. Here I'm asking them to comment on like accuracy and correctness in particular. My goal in showing you this is to highlight some takeaway points that might be implemented in peer-to-peer activities, even if you're never using a program like Eli. I have probably tried every peer review activity seemingly under the sun. I've tried it all. And in recent times, my peer review worksheets were just getting longer and longer and increasingly convoluted, which I think was overwhelming for the students, and it's overwhelming for me to go review after the fact. And so some things that I think are really helpful are the idea of streamlining peer review by providing productive constraints. And so, you're looking for 4 or 5 things that either should or should not be happening. Let's focus on those most important features. The idea of combining quantitative and qualitative metrics, I also think is really important. As a student, if I'm working with two individuals and one person gives me 2 comments and another person gives me 10, it's hard to interpret what that means on a larger scale. Does it mean my work is great and that's why one person had only 2 things to say? Does it mean my work is terrible because somebody had 10 things to say, or are they just an enthusiastic reviewer? So building in that scaled response would allow them to say, okay, both people really gave me a 4, so I'm doing well. So that quantitative component helps make sense of that qualitative feedback. And creating a kind of consistent process in peer review allows students to develop and refine those skills, which is ultimately what we want, so that they can continue to employ them when we leave our class. And it also removes some of that feedback burden from the instructor because they're giving each other the necessary feedback. So one final slide about Eli Review. I'm not a paid representative, I promise. This is the last thing I'll say about it. But so we just looked at the ability to leave contextual comments for peers. Instructors can see all of those comments as well. They can also endorse comments. And so if I really liked what somebody said, I can endorse that. That is seen by both the reviewer and the reviewee. And something that's really interesting and useful is that students can then rate the feedback they receive. And so you can see in this example, everyone's been pretty generous. They're giving a lot of 4 and 5 stars. And the idea here is that, again, to see what you might be able to take away from this general philosophy, even if you never use this program in your course, right? So students can be prompted to rate the feedback they are receiving from one another. They can reflect on that review process either for one another or for their instructor, which kind of increases their accountability for the review process and the development of their work. So now I'll turn to other means of course content delivery, including Panopto videos and how they might be used to manage feedback and foster student to instructor interaction. So I was really fortunate to work with the engineering and systems industrial and systems engineering team who have access to a recording studio on campus. And today I'm showing you just a few stills from one of the videos that we created together. And so in order to deliver course content, right, to take the place of a lecture, we created these videos, each of which was about 20 minutes or so or less. And there was video of me as the instructor intercut with slides that would deliver course content in written form, supplemented by visuals. And all of these videos came with closed captioning as well. So the video allows students to get a sense of their instructor as a real person, as just opposed to a figure that they interact with only via email. So those were kind of what I'm calling formal Panopto videos because they did have some production value. I also created a series of more informal videos using Panopto, what I called just-in-time feedback videos. So each week after students had posted their drafts, I would take an afternoon to review them, select some successful and less successful examples, anonymize them all, and then put them into a PowerPoint. And so here you're seeing some stills from a video I created that corresponds to that presentation slides activity that we've been following. And so in the video, I would include anonymized work. I would also include some written commentary on each slide. So you can see each slide has kind of a box that just distills the main point that I'm trying to convey in terms of my feedback for that particular example. And then I would also talk through the strengths and weaknesses of each piece in the video. Students typically got the video back a day or so after submitting their original writing task. And so that meant that it could help guide both their peer reviews and their final submissions. And in these videos, I emphasize that we're not just looking at the work of 4 or 5 individuals, and rather that these are examples that are representative of trends that I'm seeing across drafts, meaning the commentary is widely applicable. Generally speaking, students seemed satisfied with these videos as they provided a kind of immediate form of feedback on their work, and it also ensured that we had a regular contact point throughout the week so that they were always hearing from me and they always had a sense of what I was looking for in terms of their work. So a final feature of the 580 course that I'll talk about were weekly synchronous small group meetings. At the beginning of the semester, my TA distributed a survey to determine available meeting times, and then we scheduled these 30-minute meetings throughout the week where 5 to 7 students generally met with either myself or the TA. And this is something I was initially nervous about. They were busy students, like I mentioned, most of them work full-time, and then we're working on this master's program. And then obviously in the middle of the semester, we had the chaos of the coronavirus. And so I was afraid that this would feel like a hoop that they had to jump through. But I was really pleased with the way they turned out. I think overall students really enjoyed them, and they ended up being this kind of unique and helpful feature of the course. Just a few things I would say about them. The small groups I think are useful because they encourage participation among all class members, particularly those students who, for any number of reasons, might be reticent about participating in a large group setting. I found that creating a kind of structured agenda was particularly useful in the Zoom setting. And so in some meetings, we were working on developing particular skill sets. And so I would bring in a piece of writing or some other artifact, and we would workshop that together. In other meetings, it was primarily open discussion, but I would have the students bring discussion questions. Everybody bring 2 questions, we'll start with yours, and then we can go to mine if we have extra time. And so that kind of, although the course was primarily asynchronous, those strategic moments of synchronous interaction were helpful in fostering those connections between students and then also between myself and the students. The second course that I'll talk about today is EAS 360. I collaborated with a colleague to pilot 360 online for the first time last semester. Up until that, it had always been taught in person. Recently, I taught a slightly revised version of the course in the first summer session this summer. And this fall, all of the TechCom instructors will be teaching 360 online for the full semester for the first time. And so just a little background there, it's the required CL2 course for all undergraduate engineering and computer science students. We usually have 25 students in a class, again, discussion-based workshop course that is delivered primarily asynchronously. So a few approaches to highlight here. Throughout the semester, we make extensive use of the UB Learns discussion board. That is essentially where all projects are drafted and workshopped. And this is supplemented by platforms like Padlet, which Jessica mentioned briefly in her presentation. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. It's just a more visually engaging and customizable platform that I'm specifically using for like student introductions at the beginning of the semester. I also used the peer working groups once again to create that familiarity, that collegiality, a sense of safety, which I think is important when students are sharing writing, which can feel, even in technical writing, it can feel very personal to share that kind of work. So creating those groups is useful. And here we also used course blogs to deliver the content. And these are primarily written texts that can be supplemented with videos and other visuals. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. So as I was just saying, in the 580 graduate course, the content was largely delivered via video lecture, but in 360 we used a set of blogs. And so I'll give you some detail about how they have developed over time, and then consider some other means of fostering class discussion online. So UB Learns has a blog feature, which I used the first time I taught 360 online last summer. In my experience, it comes with a little bit of a learning curve. So I'm no longer using the actual blog feature, but I'm formatting the blogs as a discussion board. So within UB Learns, you can create a new content area and then just designate that content area as a discussion board. Each blog is its own forum that students enter, and then they can reply. And so you can kind of see what that looks like here. I've got blogs 1 through 9 up on the screen. If the blogs are taking place of essentially what we would do in an in-class discussion, in class students would have, in the traditional seated class, students would have questions and they would have comments. And so to try to recreate that, students are required to make 2 blog comments per week. And so you can see the numbers of people participating in those different blog forums here on the right-hand side of the page. So blogs can be composed directly in the UB Learns discussion board. And so here's what one version looks like. If this is something at all that you are interested in, I'll just say through trial and error, it is more effective to compose directly in UB Learns than it is to write it out in Word or even Google Slides and then try to copy and paste, because formatting can be a little bit of a beast. So here's what the traditional blog looked like. You can see it's primarily a written text, but we've also got a YouTube video in here. So this is an early blog. We're talking about rhetoric, and then they are linked to a YouTube video about the 3 rhetorical appeals. Recently, we've begun updating the blogs and transferring content to Google Slides, which can then be embedded in the discussion board forum. And so this allows for greater control over formatting, and it also enables you to create something that's a little more visually engaging than what UB Learns allows on its own. And so here's the same content, right? That's still introductory lesson on rhetoric, but you can see it looks a little bit different. I hope a little more like aesthetically pleasing than the earlier version. And you can still use videos here as well. So a key feature of the 360 class is our use of the discussion board, which I'll talk about in greater detail. So I think traditionally students can see the discussion board as something that's secondary to the real work of the class. If they have to log on every once in a while and answer some discussion questions, that's helpful, but I think sometimes it seems tangential to the other work that they're doing. But in this course, it really is our primary work site. Every draft that they compose goes onto the discussion board. It's where they do all their peer reviewing. And one thing that I think that's particularly helpful about that is that student work becomes one of the primary course texts. They really serve as models for one another. And so if someone is spinning their wheels, they don't know how to approach a project, they don't know how to format it, they have all these examples that they can turn to. This is essentially what some of those forms might look like. Each form provides students with all the information and documentation that they might need for that assignment. So again, reiterating those due dates, the point value, including attachments that will give them the guidelines or the rubric for an assignment. So those really important pieces of information are here for them, and then they're also situated in other specific sites on the course so that hopefully we're never lost. I'm also using the peer working groups for this class as well. So here's like a document that I would send to students where they're all broken up into different groups. I've, concealed their names here. In the past, I primarily had 3-person groups, and you can see when the groups get larger, just because of the number of students in the class, I've then gone in and kind of further orchestrated who's going to review whom in order to ensure that everybody gets 2 reviews. Moving forward, this is going to change a little bit. All of the groups are going to be 4 to 5 people. And so that means that if somebody, doesn't participate in that particular assignment, there's other people there to kind of pick up where they left off. These working groups, I talked about earlier and how I think they're helpful in kind of fostering that sense of collegiality. And I'll just say that I've had students, not just in the past year, but for any time I use the discussion board, say that, I've interacted with people more frequently in this online class than I did in some of my in-person classes, because they have this kind of orchestrated peer interaction, which I think is exciting. A new feature that we're trying out is Padlet, which is sort of a bulletin board-like feature. You can see what that looks like here. And so this is the beginning of the Padlet on the left-hand side for my students in the fall semester. They have instructions on what to do. I've already posted my Padlet, and so it's an introduction to me. Students can upload a picture of themselves or some other picture that they think represents them in some way. And then when everyone's done, it'll look a little something like the version that's here on the right-hand side of the page. We'll have a series of different posts, and students can comment on one another's posts as well. So just fairly easy to navigate, and hopefully a way that they can get a better sense of who their peers are. Finally, I'll just say a few quick words about some strategies that I've employed in both classes. Before class starts, usually a week to 2 weeks, if I'm doing well, before class starts, I send them a welcome letter. And so that's usually accompanies the syllabus and the schedule, and it provides a final kind of overview, or like what are the main things you really need to know about this course and how it works. When the class is in session, I send them weekly letters every Monday that remind them about the schedule and then just provides a very brief overview of what we're doing that week. Again, that kind of constant form of, or regular form of interaction. I try to curate the UB Learn site so that it is as intuitive as possible so people know where to find pieces of information. And I also develop a course overview video, which is just a Panopto video walkthrough of our UB Learn site. Here's where you would find information. Here's how you post on the discussion board. Here's where you submit your assignments. Ideally, that's available to them a week or so before class starts. Again, so that they have time to prepare and we're not kind of, in a panic on day one. And this is just a very quick look at on the left-hand side, how I've curated our UB Learn site so that every module is broken down into weekly folders. Every week they're reminded of the schedule and given important documents. And then here's what the beginning of a weekly letter would look like. And so they're getting that schedule again right off the bat, and then just a brief overview of what we're doing that week. So hopefully there's never a point in the semester where anyone's really lost on what are we doing, when's it due, where is it due, that information is always there for them. Okay, so that's been a review of everything that I've been doing since the spring semester. I'll talk a little bit about the assistance I received before recapping a few final points. The work of transitioning a course from a seated version to online is just tremendous, and I am indebted to any number of people who have helped me along the way. And so a lot of help to develop the 580 course through the School of Engineering and Applied Science, and also collaboration with Kristen Moore from my department and my TA, Macy McDonald. I've worked really closely with all of the my TechCom colleagues in engineering education to develop 360 Online, in particular Amy Baird. We piloted that course last summer. Many thanks to Amy Moore for helping me with all the formal Panopto videos. If you're interested in Eli Review, it's got great support for instructors. And a thank you to CEI for not only having me today, but all of their guidance over the last year or so. I participated in, I think, what may have been the inaugural cohort of their new faculty academy, and that was incredibly helpful and still informs a lot of the work that I do. This has been going on for a long time, and so I'm going to combine what worked or what were the results from a faculty and student perspective into one slide. So generally speaking, the first 4 columns covered what worked well, I think from both my perspective and the perspective of students. And so if I had to break it down into primary categories, I would say just being thoughtful about the course organization in order to cut down on stress for everyone. Creating those instructor to student contact points, even just things like weekly letters, kind of collective comments, whether those are written comments or videos that can go out to students. So even if you're not commenting on every single person's work every week, you are sort of touching base with them in terms of, what's happening and where you want that work to go, being generally responsive. Orchestrating that peer interaction, right? Not just providing the forum for peer interaction, but ensuring that it happens through different means, and then remaining flexible, soliciting that feedback and adapting when necessary and when you feel like you can. So of course, students had some critiques. They often want material in advance. I think this is something that seems unique to a lot of online courses. In the in-person class, they're not really asking me for material for 4 weeks from now. Online, they do want that. And so I'm working on having that material kind of prepped and at least a couple weeks at a time available to them. Offering additional technology tutorials, as a number of people have pointed out today, they're perhaps learning a lot of new forms of technology, and so trying to ease that transition. And then I would say just increasing transparency in regard to pedagogical choices that we're making. Why are we using this form of technology? Why is this assignment asking you to do whatever it's asking you to do? I think is particularly helpful in this context. So as with any endeavor, there are surprises along the way. And I would say that most of my surprises came in the form of, just how the students responded to the asynchronous learning environment. And so I found that a course delivered asynchronously can still foster student engagement and provide a sense of community if frequent points of contact are established. I found that moments of strategic synchronous interaction were generally well received, even if students had otherwise really busy schedules. And that's something I'll work on integrating into my courses this semester, including 360, which previously didn't have the same kind of moments of synchronicity. And then I'll kind of end by just saying that I know when we're first making the transition to remote learning, whether it happened in the middle of the semester or you're just, kind of taking this on for the first time, it can feel like, you're just trying to keep your head above the water. I've certainly felt that way. And now as I move forward and establish some of the basic contours of the course and become more familiar with technology, I'd like to work on really making the most of the technology that we have and establish best practices. So some things that I would like to work on moving forward: the creation of a liquid syllabus. This is pretty new terminology to me, but it's essentially creating a course site. And so instead of that syllabus that's however many pages long, it's a site that you might create using something like Google Sites that is in some ways more accessible to students, especially those students who are working on their phone. Thinking about new ways to give students feedback, whether that be collective or individualized, and then working on making the classes even more accessible. And so I've got captions on all the video lectures, which feels like a nice start, but I know that even particularly in configuring slides, they could be made more accessible for screen readers. And so continuing to work on that will be, I think, a major project moving forward. Okay, what can I share with anybody preparing for remote learning? Really just a recap of everything that I've talked about. It probably all comes down to preparation, but things like creating those contact points, trying to remain responsive and at least transparent in the choices that you are making seems to be most helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so Lauren, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. There was a little bit of a discussion and some questions in the chat about the Eli review program. And have you given any thought to how that program might work in a different discipline, say English or history, or not?
I think, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the English department, it is my impression that they are, or at least a number of instructors are using it there. In fact, I think any course where you're doing at least a moderate level of writing of any kind, it would be incredibly helpful. And if people are interested in this, I have another slide about the kind of data that Eli Review collects and shares with instructors. And so I could briefly walk us through that if you're interested. But I'll say this, that it is pretty affordable in terms of price. So for like 6 months, a 6-month subscription, it costs students $20. And so even if you're kind of interested and want to use it for a few assignments, it's not too cumbersome, and it really helps foster that student engagement, and also is useful for instructors. I'll just throw this up here briefly. If you can see this, this is the data that it would provide for instructors. And so we looked at that trait identification assignment, and you can see here, it'll break it down that says, okay, like 81% of people had this trait in their work, 97% of people had this other trait. And so as an instructor, you could say, okay, clearly we need to spend more time on X, Y, or Z. It'll give you information about how many people are commenting, what's the average number of those comments. And so that can, again, it just does some of the behind the scenes work for you so that those moments when you are offering feedback to the group can be a little more targeted.
So you answered the next question, which was how much does it cost and if the students are required to pay a fee to use it? So the answer is yes, it's a required $20 fee per semester.
Yes, and I just was looking this up before we had this session. And so there's a few options if you're interested in it for even part of the semester. 3 months, it's $12, 6 months is $20, and then $38 for a year. And when students, you can kind of integrate it into your course, and then all students have like a 2-week free trial. And so if they sign up for the course and they realize, this isn't for me, and they leave within that 2-week window, they'll never have had to pay for it.
Okay. We also have a couple questions about the liquid syllabus. A little bit more explanation about what exactly it is. Is it liquid because it's easily accessible through the web, or is it liquid because it's easily adjustable? And what do you use to create it, and are the students receptive to it?
So I have to say this is quite new for me. It's something I'm just starting to explore. And so why it is called Liquid, I couldn't exactly tell you. But my impression is this. So it would be like a course website. I think you could create it probably without a lot of tech experience via something like Google Sites. I've included the name here, Michelle Pacansky-Brock. If you Google her, she's got a blog and a lot of information about the Liquid syllabus. She's got examples that she links to, so you can see what that looks like. And the idea is that, as far as, as I know at this point, that the traditional syllabus, and I know I'm guilty of this, can sometimes get really long and cumbersome and sort of burdensome for students to read. And that becomes an additional challenge now when we're online, and especially as students in the spring had to kind of transition to going home when they might be kind of competing for the computer with other members of their family. And a lot of students might be trying to access this information on their phone. And so it makes it harder to read like Word documents or PDFs. And so if they go to a course website, the homepage might have an overview of here's the course, here's your instructor, and there'd be a link that would take you to a subpage that would say, here's our learning goals, or here's the grade breakdown. So that's essentially the idea, kind of creating a kind of just a concise web page that would house that information for your students.
Yeah. So, I spent 20 plus years in my career as a video producer and a videographer. So one of the things that stuck out at me that you talked about was your formal videos, and you talked about production values. So that kind of stuck out at me as a production guy. So I'm just a little curious, how do you define production values, and why do you think it's important to kind of bump those up a notch for those quote unquote formal videos?
Mm-hmm. I would maybe return to some of the things that Jim was talking about earlier today. And so I would say that my videos that I created kind of with the help of the ISE department were probably not as engaging as his, where he's in front of the green screen. But he made a point that the kind of traditional Panopto video, where maybe you're just a floating head in the corner, doesn't really doesn't give students perhaps the same sense of who you are as an individual, and can look a little stiff, right? That you don't have the same access to kind of move around in the space, which creates a little bit more of that interactive feeling. And so in those videos, the kind of formal videos, it would intercut between scenes of me and then kind of written course content. And they just did a really, kind of lovely job with creating some of those visuals, making sure that all of the captions were right where they should be, things like that.
Yeah, great. So we only have 2 more minutes, and I thought this was a great question to kind of end the day with and wrap things up. So very early on in your presentation, you talked about another transition really that is coming or could potentially be coming, and that's transitioning from this kind of emergency, we need to just get this done and get this online, to a transition of now that when things start settling down, we have more time, we can do more things and really create online courses that are really a cut above what we might be doing in an emergency. Could you maybe just expand on that just a little bit and tell us a little bit about what you see coming, or what you would like to see faculty to do after kind of the emergency is over?
Sure. I think for me, one of the things that stands out the most is probably working on creating courses that are accessible for all students. And so certainly in videos, for instance, that I was creating this semester, making sure that they're all captioned, that was a nice start, but I know even with different slides that I'm creating, like I can work on those to make them more accessible for people who might be using a screen reader. I was at a CEI workshop on creating an accessible course, I think sometime in the fall, and I took a lot away from that. But it also it's time intensive to make sure that that's happening. And in that emergency situation when we're just trying to get something up online, it can be hard to make sure that all those boxes are checked. And so that, I think, is probably at the forefront of what I would like to do moving forward.
I think that's a great wrap up, Lauren. Thank you so very much for sharing all that with us today. It's really much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.